Welcome to dentReviews. Today I want to do a review of the Thieaudio Monarch. This is on loan from Precog over at headphones.com, so I want to give a thanks out to him for giving me the opportunity to hear these. This is a lovely set. You can see the front panel here of the earpiece is like an opalescent kind of stone mineral look to it. Has a really nice shimmery, I don't know if you can see that on the right side. It's very nice. It almost looks like some stone I forget what they call it, but anyway, it's a very nice kind of a gleam to it. Yeah. Anyway, if you know me in my reviews, you'll know that I'm more of a practicality type person. I would rather have this be a simple stainless steel shell if it saved me $50 to $100. That's just my preference. But if you like the way your things look as well as the way they sound, these are a nice looking set. They're not very gaudy. They have a little bling factor, I guess, but they don't look over the top. They just look like a nice kind of a jewelry-esque type of appearance to them. So the cable itself, if you look, it's pretty thick. Honestly, it looks a lot. It reminds me of a bike lock. I'm not even joking. This seriously looks like a big, thick cable, almost like a small bicycle lock cable. But anyway, it's got a nice cord lock. Slides up and down with some firm but good resistance. It's got a very nice Y split. I love micro small Y splits like that. I'm not a fan of this in the slightest, but depends on what device you have. I don't know what cable you can choose when you buy this. I want to say there was an option to choose a different cable configuration, but this is a 2.5 millimeter cable with a 3.5 millimeter adapter. So it looks pretty unwieldy coming out of an MP3 player, and I'd actually worry about the stress on the jack. However, they do sell this cable. This is the EST cable, and they sell a configuration where it has the 3.5 directly to the cable. So I think you might be able to order the Monarch with that cable as an option. But again, as this is a loaner, I don't have that option. So I'm not a fan of this adapter system unless, of course, you primarily used 2.5 and then you have the 3.5 if you need it. That's great. So just keep that in mind. So the cable is very durable, feels nice. Has a small bit of stress relief plastic coming out there. It's kind of hefty in a sense, but it's flexible and it feels durable. So it's probably, I'd consider it above average durability, maybe average to below average in terms of convenience because of this adapter, but otherwise it's good. The earphones themselves are pretty chunky. You can see they're fairly large. I'm going to show you, this is the Oxygen from Tanjima or Tangem or however you say that. I have no idea. But you can see the Oxygen in almost every dimension is about half the size. So if I can hold these here, you can see that makes the Monarch look like a behemoth, which it is probably one of the largest universal earphones that I've ever tried. So personally for me, unfortunately, the first negative I'd have to give to this earphone is that even if I thought the sound was impeccable, I probably couldn't own one myself. It is just large enough in the height and width that this part and this part, I believe, one of these top corners, presses against my ear in a way that even after a few minutes becomes pretty uncomfortable, and after a long time actually hurts. So for me personally, I have not been able to fit these for extended periods without pain. Now, I'd say they're very, very slightly too large. If they were just even a touch smaller, they would be fine because the depth isn't as big of a deal as the width and the height for my ear. So, to each his own. That's going to vary based on your ear design, but keep it in mind, these are pretty large in terms of a universal earphone. You can see here they have what looks to be a brown automotive style Knowles filter on the top, and then the metal mesh on the front, and it's a 2-pin connector, kind of like the Moondrop connectors. Let's see if I can put this back using the camera. Boop. So it's a pretty standard connector, easy to get another cable if you want to replace the cable. Overall, I'd say they feel very durable. They're not too heavy. So if your ears are large enough, they're probably going to be pretty comfortable. It's just that width issue I talked about. So that's the earphone and the cable, and then the case is kind of this leatherish case. That's pretty nice. It says Thieaudio on it. It's a little large. It's not really a pocket carry case, but it's good for storage if you want to store the earphone. So that's the overall build. Now, always the most important factor to me is the sound quality. So How do these things sound? Well, sort of a mixed bag for me. So first things first, I've tried a lot of different tips to just try to see if I could figure out, are there any tips that kind of accentuate certain areas of the response or change the sound in any way? And really, I haven't found much. I mean, if you look at the bore hole size on tips, that's probably the single biggest factor that affects the sound response of an earphone. If you put an earphone that generally has a large bore size designed to work with it, and you put a narrow bore size, that's going to restrict the frequency response. And what's going to happen is you're going to either get peaks in the treble, or you're going to get variations throughout the response that are unwanted. That's not how the earphone was designed. Now, necessarily, it's not a bad thing. It depends on what you're going for. Sometimes an earphone might have too much treble or too little treble, and you could kind of maybe tweak it a little bit with earphone tips. But what I prefer to do is I try to find different tips that have the same opening diameter as the stock tips, that maybe give me a little bit better fit or maybe a little bit more depth. And that helps sometimes prevent resonances if the earphones aren't already in your ear enough, because these are pretty big. They may not be going in your ear deep enough. You might get a little bit of a resonance at 7.5 kilohertz or 10 kilohertz or whatever, and those can shift a little bit. So I have found so far that these tips here, which are just some biflange tips I used to use many years ago, these offer me the same stock sound, but I feel like I get a little bit less peaks in the treble, and I think it is because of the depth of these ear tips. So nonetheless, my impressions with the standard size tips and the dual flange is pretty similar. I just feel like these are a little bit smoother in the treble, the high treble. And when I say treble, I'm referring to like maybe 10 to 12 kilohertz, somewhere around there. It just seems a little bit less peaky. So always try a bunch of different tips to see which works best for your ear. I have a whole kit of tips from various earphones and packages that I've bought over the years, and I just cycle through them all to get what works best. So what is the sound signature like? Well, I would call this very, very neutral in what I consider neutrality, with a deep bass shelf. And what I mean by that is, if you're familiar with the Moondrop S8, that is another very neutral sounding set, whereas these might have a slight more treble presence, a little bit more of a cool forward treble, which in a way I almost like sometimes more than the S8. However, the S8 overall has a very balanced sound from top to bottom with no real flaws whatsoever. These have a very balanced sound, a little more uneven upper treble. There's slight peakiness somewhere. I forget the graph, but I think it graphed around somewhere between like 7 and 10 kilohertz or something like that. There's just a slight peak. It's not super audible unless you're doing a direct comparison, but it is there. And I think that the peaks and the dips of this earphone, I don't know if they did it on purpose, but they seem designed, in my opinion, in a way that accentuates details without really being fatiguing. So they've boosted these specific regions just enough to give you a sense of heightened depth, heightened width, and heightened clarity, just pushing it enough that you're not ever going to get fatiguing or harshness. So that's a very interesting tuning. It's super, super close to what I would consider a reference treble and mid response, despite maybe a tiny bit of that pushing it a little to get that treble detail out. Other than that, I'd say they're very, very neutral, and that could be a bonus depending on what your preference is. Where these sort of fall apart for me is the bass. Now, I think they did strike a very good balance to try to have a good, accurate response, but get a speaker-like bass that seems to be what a lot of people want, is they want the bass to sound more like a speaker, but without the rest of the earphone being destroyed by the mid-bass warmth clouding up the treble, things like that. So what they've done is they've created a bass shelf that's really low. It's almost solely sub-bass and really deep bass. And that, in a sense, keeps it away from the rest of the spectrum, so it doesn't muddy it up. There is a slight dip in the bass right above that, though. So I'd say these don't have perfectly linear bass, although it's very good, down to that sub where it's boosted. Now, in my opinion, it's boosted too much. I feel as though when I'm listening to these, the impression that I get is that I have a very neutral response, and then that someone turned on a subwoofer and maybe just adjusted the subwoofer too much. So in a sense, it almost to me sounds like kind of a separate entity of its own. Like there's literally a little subwoofer inside of these that is not part of the overall coherency of the earphone. It just kind of stands out as a separate thing to me. So I literally wish I had a volume control to just turn that subwoofer down to kind of blend it in with the rest of the sound, and then it would be phenomenal. But for me personally, the bass is a little bit too much. It's nice that it's isolated so low because it doesn't necessarily detract from the clarity and the overall sound, but it just comes across as a little bit distracting to me. Because like I said, it just sounds like someone in a car where they turn their subwoofer up, and it's like, well, I don't want to hear the subwoofer, I want to hear the music. But because of the isolation, it's probably striking a good balance for most people, and I think they did a good choice in tuning. But for me, I think something like the S8 is a little bit balanced better in the bass. It does have a little bit more bass warmth, which is very slight, and I would still consider it neutral. But compared to this, these are a little bit more lean in the bass, but heavy in the sub bass, deep bass. So if you're going for strictly overall tonal balance, I would say the Moondrop S8 is actually the way to go, and it's going to provide a more coherent and a more smooth response from top to bottom. However, I'd say these might actually push the details in the mid to lower treble a little bit more than the Moondrop S8. So in a way, they sound a little bit more forward in some areas, and it's kind of a nice sound. I think the S8 comes across as a little bit more maybe wispy sounding, and that's probably not the best word, but the treble and the overall sound has a very light and wispiness to it, whereas these have a little bit more of a cool firmness to it in the whole spectrum, not just the bass. The treble has like a cool directness to it. They're very wide and they're very good imaging. The layering of instruments, the distinct instrument texturing, separation from each other, all of that sort of technical stuff is very good, and I think they did a very good job in that technical performance aspect. I think the biggest thing that keeps me holding back from saying these are the best is really just that bass shelf. I think they overdid the bass shelf and the bass response and the size and discomfort of the actual body. For me, those two things alone are enough that I probably would not own this. It has definitely been a joy to listen to, and I think it's a very good IEM. For the person that can fit them with no problem, who craves a little bit more of that deep bass, these might just be phenomenal for you. I mean, these are truly some of the best frequency response and sound quality I've heard in any earphone for probably everything above, let's say, 300 or 400 hertz. I mean, they do a really good job. Are they peaky? Maybe so slightly in some areas that don't really make a negative impact on the sound, but maybe just take it away from that true linear transparency. And in that regard, maybe the S8 would be better for you. I think the S8 is probably a little bit more truly linear in most of the spectrum, with maybe just a little bit of that mid-bass warmth, if you want to call it that. But they're not a warm earphone by any means. How do they compare to something like an Etymotic? Well, obviously these are going to have a lot more deep bass than an Etymotic, so there's that. I'd say the Etymotics sound a little bit more linear, but they don't sound nearly as open and spacious as these. These have a much better directionality, soundstage, width, depth, all that kind of stuff that the Etymotics are very, generally speaking, described as being flat, not just response-wise, but in sound. So these are probably a little bit more engaging would be the best word to use. It's a very attractive set with a very good tonal balance, a very engaging sound with those small caveats that I mentioned. So I'll probably do some more comparisons in another video because I'm doing a couple other earphones here soon. I'll talk about these compared to other earphones. But for the price at $700, are these a good value? I would say if they fit you well and you desire that bass response, then there's probably no better earphone you can buy. These are phenomenal. If you value comfort and you value more true, transparent linearity, that's what I consider linearity, no peaks or dips, everything's smooth from bottom to top, I actually believe the Moondrop S8 is a better value and a better sounding earphone overall. These are sort of a tribrid, they call it. There are 3 different technologies inside of this thing. You have an electrostatic for the high treble, 6 balanced armatures for the treble and mids, and a dynamic driver for the bass. I'm sorry, there's 2 electrostatic drivers in there, and a dynamic driver for the bass. So the dynamic driver does do a good job of getting that bass impact and that nice quality bass sound. The electrostatic, I don't know if you should take that with a grain of salt. I think they might be electrostatic, like not like a normal electrostatic headphone. I've heard differing opinions on that. I'm not sure what the actual technology is, but I don't think it's the same as an electrostatic headphone. But nonetheless, I feel as though what I'm hearing at the upper ranges of the treble is very well presented. It's never harsh. It's fast and detailed and airy. They do a really good job in that regard. So I think they did, considering there's so many freaking drivers in this thing, it's amazing they even fit in here. But they did a really good job of blending and balancing those drivers to work together to sound like one unit. The only exception being, and I don't think it's necessarily the driver, but the tuning of the bass kind of makes the bass sound like it's an isolated part of the spectrum. And I think that's probably its biggest benefit for some people and biggest weakness for others. In my case, that just happens to be a weakness. In some songs, it sounds great and you don't notice it too much. And in other songs, it's just very overbearing and distracting. And I wish there was a little way to adjust that sub bass volume. So nonetheless, that is the Thieaudio Monarch. That's a superb set. Thanks again over to Precog at headphones.com for the loaner. And I highly recommend these in the price bracket if that is your desired sound. Otherwise, the Moondrop's an alternative. And there's a couple other alternatives that I'm looking into right now. But these are a very well-made, good-sounding set if they fit you and you want that sound. So thank you again, as always, for watching. If you have any questions at all, just leave them below. Thank you, guys.